Chapter 12. The next night, Conrad lit his lamp at the small table in his cabin and pulled out the little reader. The letters were still the same, but his mind struggled to come up with the sounds. As his finger traveled along the lines like Isabel had shown him, he couldn't produce the words as he had before. It had been so much easier with Isabel there, when he had had to get the answer right to see her smile at him. Though he wanted to learn for his own good, there was no immediate benefit without her. The lamp wasn't bright enough, the table not right. He couldn't focus. Would Isabel think less of him if he went to her and asked for her to just sit with him while he worked? She said she believed in his ability, had convinced him he wasn't as muddled as he felt. So why was he back to the same problems when she wasn't there? He slid a slip of cut tin in to hold his place and closed the book. He turned down the lamp, resolved to leave his cabin and go see her. The book fit easily in his vest pocket. His cabin wasn't far from the house, and if he hurried, Isabel would still be sitting in the front room reading. Hastening across the open area between the shelter wall of the bullpen and the machine shed, he slid through the dark expanse as quietly as possible. Stan slithered from the shadows and stood in front of him, his hand cradled at his waist, just inches from his barker. "You made me lose my job. How am I supposed to find another one out here? Doesn't my family matter to you? Or is your family the only thing on your mind lately, you big dumb oaf?" Conrad measured the distance out of the alley between the two buildings. Letting Stan's words get to him would only cloud his judgment. "You did the damage yourself, Stan. You had a good place here, lots of freedom and plenty of trust, but you broke that. You know darn well I didn't call for flour. I wouldn't even ask you to buy foodstuff for the house. It isn't your job. And 25 men? At $5 a day? You know what our going wages are, and that's not it." Stan snickered in the shadows. "I said it yesterday. I'll say it again. Prove it." His dedication to keep Stan from getting to him was fast dissolving. "We live by our word out here, Stan. That must have bothered you. It's time for you to go somewhere where they'll bend the way you want. That place isn't here. You should have cleared your things out earlier. You need to get, now." "You live by your word. That's a good yarn." He spat and squinted at Conrad in the near darkness. "Wonder if all those men your brother sent home today are saying you live by your word." "They wouldn't be saying anything if you hadn't tricked them. That was all on you." Conrad didn't want to scuffle with the man. He wasn't worried about besting him, but he didn't want to go see Isabel after a fight. He was also tired of wasting his time shooting the breeze between the barns with Stan, who wouldn't listen to him anyway. There was a lovely lady waiting for him. Stan was a waste of precious time. "See now?" Stan chuckled. "They don't feel tricked by me. They feel taken by you." Conrad reached for his gun, but he'd taken it off when he'd come in from the range that evening, and he hadn't thought he'd need it to see Isabel. "Now, isn't that a shame? Caught empty-handed." Stan sneered. "Not much of a cowboy getting caught without your irons." 3 more men crept from the darkness. None of them were visible in the shadows. Every muscle in his arm flexed in readiness. 4 to 1. It was only one more than when he'd taken on all his brothers. It could be done, as long as they played fair. One of the men furthest from him drew in the blink of an eye, and Conrad only had a moment to think before he saw the bright flash and felt the back of his head crack against the hard dirt. The book didn't hold her interest in the slightest. Wordsworth just wasn't compelling in all his talk of life as normal, when her heart was ready to believe life was anything but. Conrad wanted to spend time with her, to call on her. Now that she had been a married woman, she didn't have to seek permission from her parents or the approval of anyone else. The freedom was a giddiness that wouldn't be contained. She had hoped that he would still come by yet. He'd gone home to sup that evening instead of coming to the house. That was his normal routine, so it shouldn't bother her. But it wasn't as if she could go to his cabin and eat, unless he invited her. Her heart clenched in her chest at the thought. No, even a widow had no business stepping into the cabin of a single man. A shot pierced the night, and Izzy fairly jumped out of her skin. In the few days she had been to the ranch, she hadn't heard the report of a gun, and coming so late in the evening when the shooter couldn't see to aim. Nathan ran down the stairs, tugging his braces over his shoulders. He reached for the rifle over the door and ran into the night. Izzy stared out the window, too frightened to think about her own safety. Someone out there could be hurt. Someone like Conrad. Barton would be at his home with Lula. She had been more tired the closer she came to her time. They wouldn't have left their house. Arnold and Eli were both at their homes, and as far as she knew, didn't walk about at night. But Conrad did. He'd been out almost every evening. A sick dread took over her stomach. Within a few moments, 3 of the brothers wandered into the front. It was too dark to tell for sure who they were, but not one of them looked big enough to be the bear that was Conrad. All 3 men met their father in the darkness between 2 of the barns, barely discernible in the dark. When they reappeared, 2 balanced the weight of large shoulders, while 1 carried the feet. Nathan held his gun and led the way. He was too big to be anyone but Conrad. She choked back a sob. He couldn't be dead. Not now. Not when she had just started looking to him and seeing hope in a future. Barton had Conrad's boots, 1 in each hand, and Izzy rushed to the door to hold it open as they brought Conrad in. His eyes were open but unfocused. She searched him for any sign of blood, but there was none that she could see. They flopped him onto the sofa, and the breath whooshed from his chest. Isabel knelt on the floor beside him and reined in her fear. He was still with her, even awake. She should be overjoyed. But the distant look in his eyes was no reassurance. Nathan stood behind her. "I found him between the barns. There was no one out there by the time I got there. Hopefully he'll be able to tell us what happened." There was an area of black on his vest, right over his heart. She touched it and found a hole. As she lifted the vest, she found the primer she'd given him the night before and pulled it from the wide pocket. He had placed it in his vest with the front of the book facing him, and a cut piece of tin to keep his place in the front of the book where they'd left off. The whole of the book and the tin absorbed the shot, and the bullet lay wedged in the pages. Nathan took it from her, and she shuddered at how closely she had come to losing Conrad. Izzy wrapped her arm around him as best she could, and rested her head against his heart. The cadence just as calming as it had been the evening before when she had bared her heart, and he had held her anyway. Now he needed her. Conrad ran shaking fingers through her hair, but his hold was weak, and soon his hand fell at his side, and he slept. His brothers and father retired to another room, but Izzy couldn't leave him alone. When he woke, he'd still be in that moment, just before he was shot. If it were her laying there, she would want someone with her, to calm her. If it were her, she would want him to do the same for her. She rested her head on his chest once more, and let the rise and fall lull her as she held him.